They thought I was a delay, a burden. Elias said I was just a small name on a small paycheck. Easy to dismiss. Octavia laughed, a sharp smile over that six-figure mahogany table. She did not know the laptop in my bag could collapse their entire firm. I saw the fear in Elias's eyes when I calmly stood up. I did not cry. I did not beg. I smiled, because in 30 days, I would take the seat of the woman who laughed at me. My name is Sarah Vance. I'm 33 years old, and I was invited to watch my husband get crowned. The invitation to Sterling and Rowe LLP was for a dinner, ostensibly to celebrate our anniversary. But I knew the truth. It was a formal viewing, a chance for the senior partners to sign off on Elias Thorne before they made him partner. The San Francisco air was cold, but the private dining room at Sterling and Rowe was suffocatingly warm, smelling of old money and expensive leather. Elias had his hand on the small of my back, but it was a gesture of possession, not affection. "And this," Elias said, his voice booming with a confidence he only ever used in these rooms, "is my wife, Sarah." He gestured to me as he introduced me to the managing partner. "She's a senior analyst over at the Sentinel Group." The partner nodded, a polite, vacant smile. "Sentinel, you're one of the watchdogs, then, keeping us all honest." Elias laughed, a tight, forced sound. "Someone has to count the pennies. Right, I keep telling her. My first-year partner bonus will be more than her next 5 years of salary, but she enjoys her little projects." I felt the heat rise in my neck. My little projects at Sentinel, a non-profit financial oversight agency, had unwound 2 major offshore fraud schemes. But here, in this room, I was just the wife who didn't understand real money. Then, Octavia Hayes walked in. The room shifted, the partners straightening their ties. She was the firm's rainmaker, the mentor Elias spoke of with a reverence that always set my teeth on edge, and, I suspected, more than a mentor. She was tall, wearing a steel-gray dress that probably cost more than my car, and she moved with the lethal grace of a predator. Her eyes, a pale, assessing blue, scanned the room and landed on me. It was not a look of appraisal. It was a look of dismissal. She knew who I was, and she had already decided I was irrelevant. Elias was at her side instantly, his hand leaving my back to lightly touch her arm, guiding her to the seat at the head of the table, a seat that should have been for the managing partner. The conversation turned to the Aegis Corp case, a massive, complex lawsuit that was Elias's ticket to the partnership. They spoke in rapid-fire legal shorthand, a world Elias had desperately wanted to belong to, a world I had financially supported him through for years. "The risk," one partner was saying, "is that the SEC filing for the acquisition was too opaque. We could be looking at penalties." "The risk isn't the filing," I said, my voice cutting through the cigar smoke. Everyone turned. I had broken the wives are silent rule. "The risk is in the valuation of the subsidiary assets. They're using a Cayman Islands holding company to inflate the value. The filing is just the smoke. The fire is in their offshore ledger." The room was silent. Elias looked horrified. Octavia Hayes slowly placed her wine glass on the table. She gave a small, thin-lipped smile. "Sarah," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "your job is to count pennies. Here, we move fortunes. You do not understand the scale of this table." She laughed, a dry, rattling sound. Elias, to my left, said nothing. He just stared at his plate, his silence a deafening cheer for her. I waited for him. I waited for the man I'd put through law school, the man who I'd coached through his LSATs, the man who just this morning had kissed me and called me his secret weapon. I waited for him to say, "Octavia, that's out of line." Or, "Actually, Sarah knows more about this than anyone." Instead, he cleared his throat. He put his hand on my arm, a heavy, silencing weight. "Honey," he said, loud enough for the table to hear. "They're right. Don't you worry about the big numbers. You stick to your Sentinel projects. It's more your size. And that was it. It was not a shattering of glass. It was the click of a lock, the slow, cold realization that the man I loved was gone. He had been gone for a long time. In his place was this stranger, this weak, ambitious shell of a man who would watch me be humiliated just to get one step closer to a corner office. I was a liability he was finished with. I looked directly at Elias. The pleading in my eyes was gone, replaced by something else, something cold. I saw a flicker of confusion in his expression. He expected tears. He expected me to shrink. I stood up. "Excuse me," I said, my voice perfectly level. "I have an early morning." I did not wait for a response. I walked out of the private dining room, through the hushed, mahogany-paneled hallways of Sterling and Row, and out onto the street. I did not cry. I walked 2 blocks to a dark, quiet bar I knew. I sat in a booth, ordered a 12-year-old scotch, neat, and pulled my laptop from my bag. I did not open my Sentinel Group portal. I did not open my email. I opened a private browser window and navigated to the login page for Elias's personal brokerage account, the one he used for his side investments, the one he thought I was too busy counting pennies to know about. I got home after midnight. The house was silent, heavy. Elias was already in bed, the heavy, rhythmic breathing of a man who sleeps without guilt. He had not bothered to wait up, had not bothered to call. In the dining room, the scene of our canceled anniversary dinner was perfectly preserved, like a tomb. 2 place settings of the wedding china I had insisted we use, 2 crystal wine glasses, still empty. The bottle of Cabernet I had opened hours ago, a '98 vintage, was still breathing on the sideboard. It looked like a mockery. I did not feel sadness. I felt an icy, profound clarity. I began to clean. I picked up his plate, his napkin, his unused silver, and I carried them to the kitchen. I did not put them in the dishwasher. I put them in the donation box in the pantry. I went back and collected my own. I packed the good china away, deep in the cupboards where we would never use it. I put the silver back in its velvet-lined box and tucked it under the stairs. I was performing a symbolic erasure. By the time I finished, the dining room table was bare, just a slab of polished wood reflecting the empty room. I was beginning my perfect compliance. Elias wanted me to be smaller. He wanted me to stay in my lane, to count my pennies. Fine. My support, the invisible architecture that held his entire life together, was officially closed. The laundry service I managed, the dry cleaning I scheduled, the meals I planned, the social calendar I maintained, it was all finished. At 2 a.m, I sat at my desk, not in the shared home office, but in my personal study. My first move was financial. I opened a new, high-yield savings account at a bank Elias had never heard of, one headquartered in a different state. I transferred my entire personal savings, just over $50,000 that I had saved before the marriage. Then, I logged into the HR portal for the Sentinel Group. I accessed my direct deposit information. I rerouted 80% of my monthly paycheck to the new account. My penny-counting salary was now my escape fund. At 3 a.m., I drafted an email. I sent it from my secure Sentinel address to Patricia Reeves. Patricia is the most feared divorce attorney in San Francisco, specializing in high-asset dissolutions for tech founders and venture capitalists. I could not email her about a divorce. Not yet. The subject read, "Urgent request for consultation. Financial risk profile. Sterling and Row." I knew she would take the meeting. We scheduled it for the following afternoon, citing a critical work emergency. While I waited for the sun to rise, I opened a new, encrypted file on my secure drive. I labeled it Journal of Record. This was not a diary for feelings. It was a ledger for evidence. Column A date, column B event, column C, quote, column D, Elias Thorne, response, action. I started with that night. Date October 12th. Event Sterling and Row partner dinner. Quote, "Your job is to count pennies. You do not understand the scale of this table. Oh, Hayes, Elias Thorne. Response. Silence. Honey, they're right. It's more your size. I worked backward, documenting every late night he claimed was deal closing, every time he had dismissed my career achievements, every significant withdrawal from our joint accounts for client development. The next morning, I was at the Sentinel Group before sunrise. My supervisor, Mark, saw the light on in my office. Sarah, everything all right? Everything is fine. Mark, I said, not looking up from my screen. I need to request expanded access. I want the full audit portfolios for the next quarter. Specifically, I want to see every client file that intersects with Sterling and Rowe LLP. I have a hunch their risk mitigation is sloppy. Mark knew my hunches. My penny counting had flagged 2 major fraud schemes last year. You got it, he said. What's the target? I think their partners are too focused on the big picture, I said. I want to see what they're missing in the details. I went home during my lunch break. Elias was, predictably, already gone. I went straight to our home office, the one I had organized, the one that held all our shared financial data. I changed the electronic lock code on the door. Then I went to the backup drive we kept in the fireproof safe. It was the drive I had used to compile Elias's partner portfolio, 18 months of my labor, analyzing his case history, projecting his billable hours, and polishing his financial record to make him look like a king. He thought I was his secretary. He forgot I was an analyst. I took the drive. That night, back in my locked study, I plugged it in. I was preparing to cross-reference his portfolio with the audit files I now had access to, looking for the overlap. That is when I saw the email. It was in my personal inbox, sent to an old address I barely used. The sender was anonymous, a jumbled string of characters from a secure email service. The subject line was empty. There were 2 attachments. The first was a scanned image, a hotel folio from the St. Regis, dated 2 weeks prior. The weekend Elias was supposedly at a solo litigation summit in Napa. The charges were damning room service for 2, couples massages, a bottle of champagne at 3 a.m. The folio was in his name. The incidentals, however, were signed with a sharp, clear signature, O. Hayes. My hand did not shake. My heart did not race. It just settled, hard and heavy, like a stone. The second attachment was a blurry PDF. It was a wire transfer confirmation. I could not make out all the details, but I saw enough. A large sum of money, a transfer from a client account, and Elias's signature, authorizing it. It was the same suspicious transaction I had glimpsed at the bar. I did not cry. I did not rage. I saved the files, encrypted them, and moved them to the secured hard drive. I closed the laptop. The architecture of my silence was now complete. I had the blueprints for his destruction. The unraveling was subtle at first. Elias was like a large, complicated machine that required meticulous, constant maintenance, and I had simply unplugged the service contract. He was the kind of man who never looked inside a laundry basket. Clean clothes simply appeared in the closet. Now, the service had been canceled. 2 days after the dinner, he stood in the closet doorway, his face twisted in annoyance. Sarah, where are my French cuff shirts? The blue ones, they're not pressed. I was reading a Sentinel Group file and audit report that required my absolute concentration. I did not look up. Elias, I canceled the dry cleaning service. We agreed to cut back on extraneous costs. Remember, we should both be focused on our careers right now. That was the key. He could not argue with his own prioritization of his career. The next morning, the lack of his perfectly brewed, $18 a bag single-origin coffee caused a visible tremor in his hands. Did the espresso machine break? No, I replied, sipping my own instant cup. I just didn't have time this morning. I had an early call with the European division. You know I can't manage your schedule and my own. His questions were sharp, loaded with thinly veiled hostility. He wanted me to break, to apologize for my lapses, and to fall back into the role of his domestic manager. But I answered with absolute, crystalline politeness. I was an employee who was perfectly adhering to the new, rigorous professional boundaries he had established. While he scrambled for a clean pair of socks, I was deeply embedded in the Sterling and Rowe client expenditure reports I'd secured access to through Sentinel. I was looking for the bleed. Lawyers bill for everything. But Octavia Hayes's expense reports were less like a ledger and more like a work of artful camouflage. High-end dining, luxury travel, and a disturbing number of recurring charges to a specific anonymous consulting firm. I cross-referenced the dates with the St. Regis bill. The overlap was significant. He tried to provoke me. One evening, he threw his briefcase down hard, making the walls shake. "I saw Octavia today," he snapped. "She said you were incredibly rude the other night, walking out like that. You embarrassed me." "Sarah." I finally looked up from my laptop, my expression calm. "Did I?" "Elias. You said they were right. You said my work was more my size. I am simply respecting your judgment and focusing on my size of the work." I leaned forward slightly. "You are the one who gets to decide when we talk about us. I am respecting your limits." He was furious because I had used his own words as an unbreakable shield. The air of the room was thick with his rage, but I was untouchable inside my silence. I also began to reconnect. The isolation Elias had subtly imposed over the years, moving me away from my old professional network, insisting our social life revolve only around his firm, was over. I had dinner with an old friend from my college paper, Liam. He was now an investigative reporter for a major regional outlet. I did not give him names. I talked about the culture of big law in San Francisco, the pressure to hit profit margins, the ethical compromises I'd witnessed in other firms. I planted the seed of a future exposé, watching his eyes light up. I was building my outside support network, piece by piece. The following afternoon, I sat across from Patricia Reeves in her stark, high-rise office. I laid out the binder I had prepared. It was not a binder of pain. It was a financial history. "I started my career 3 years before he started law school," I explained, pointing to the spreadsheets. "I worked 2 jobs. I paid his tuition, his student loans, and his bar prep course. That's nearly $200,000 of marital funds my labor invested directly into his earning potential." Patricia, whose expression was normally carved from granite, raised an eyebrow. "Most women bring a list of insults. You brought a venture capital prospectus. This is key. Sarah. The law recognizes an investment in human capital. His potential partner income is a marital asset, and we can claim a substantial percentage based on your support." But the real strike came that night. Back on my personal laptop, I ran the analysis I had been building Elias's partner portfolio data cross-referenced with the blurry wire transfer from the anonymous email. Twist. The large sum he had funneled out of our joint brokerage was not just a side investment. It was seed capital for a highly opaque, unregulated hedge fund. The fund was advised by a consulting group I recognized from Octavia's expense reports. I had found the nexus of their professional and personal misconduct. Elias was risking our shared money on a shady deal advised by his mistress's client. The blurry wire transfer was the payment into that fund. The transaction was a textbook conflict of interest, designed to bypass Sterling and Rowe's compliance protocols. Elias's descent accelerated. Now, he was calling me at the Sentinel group repeatedly. "Sarah, where is the draft motion for the Aegis case? I need the red line version. I can't find the keys to the BMW." I would see the calls on my screen and silence the ringer. I would only reply hours later. "With a single text, I'm in a high-priority meeting. I will respond to your logistical inquiries later." His panic was nourishing. The final piece of preparation was logistical. I found a small, impeccably furnished apartment on the other side of the bay, in a building with no connection to any of Elias's circles. I used the money from my new secret bank account. I paid 6 months of rent in advance, ensuring no recurring monthly charge would flag the withdrawal on my shared bank statements. I signed the lease, feeling the weight of the city lift from my shoulders. I was not just counting pennies anymore. I was building a fortress. I had officially initiated the deep dive. At the Sentinel Group, I assigned myself as the lead analyst on the Aegis Corp file, citing the sheer complexity of their cross-border transactions. Aegis Corp was a massive conglomerate and Sterling and Rowe's most prestigious client. My internal files quickly confirmed the link. Octavia Hayes was the lead counsel for Aegis Corp's European restructuring. Elias, though a junior on the file, handled the domestic asset shielding the exact area I had flagged as suspicious. The beauty of this was that my scrutiny was now completely legal, professional, and mandated by my agency. I had legitimate reason to examine the inner workings of my opponent's most critical business dealings. I was no longer an angry wife. I was a government-sanctioned auditor. I met with Liam, the investigative reporter. Again. We were at a dim corner cafe, and I spoke strictly in hypotheticals. I told him about the overwhelming pressure on big law partners to deliver 9-figure deals, about the corners I suspected were being cut to achieve those profits. It creates a culture, I murmured, stirring my tea. A culture where a partner might look the other way, or actively structure aggressive tax shelters, or worse. I gave him a subtle, perfectly timed hint about Aegis Corp's reliance on overseas subsidiaries to minimize tax liability. I watched him take notes, his journalist instincts recognizing the threat of corruption. I knew that once the story broke, it would create the necessary regulatory noise for Sentinel to move from observation to full-scale enforcement. The big twist came 3 days later. Buried deep in a transaction ledger I had to pull directly from the Cypriot financial regulator. Octavia and Elias had not just used a vague hedge fund, they had systematically created a shell corporation whose sole purpose was to funnel Aegis Corp's overseas revenue back into domestic investment accounts that were structurally indistinguishable from money laundering. It was elegant, legally gray, and if exposed, devastating. Elias had been the technical architect of the transfers, Octavia the legal authority signing off. I spent an entire weekend collating every piece of digital evidence, the coded emails, the bank statements detailing the movement of millions of dollars, the St. Regis bill, and the wire transfer authorization. I burned everything to a military-grade encrypted USB stick, labeled only with a generic case number. I now had 2 complete, devastating files, one for the divorce and one for the federal prosecutor's office. The increasing professional threat I posed seemed to break Elias. After days of unanswered texts, he appeared at the Sentinel Group building in the middle of the afternoon. He was pale, unshaven, and carried an ostentatious bouquet of 24 long-stemmed red roses. He looked like a beggar trying to reclaim a throne. My secretary buzzed me. "Ms. Vance, a Mr. Thorne is here for you in the lobby. He says it's urgent and personal." "I'll take the meeting," I instructed. I met him in the sterile marble lobby. He rushed towards me, the roses held out like a peace offering. "Sarah, thank God," he whispered, his voice desperate. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry about everything. I'm a mess. I need to talk. We need to fix this." Instead of anger, I put on a mask of cool, professional concern. "Elias, this is a bit irregular. You should have scheduled an appointment." I glanced pointedly at the roses. "I'm in the middle of preparing a high-risk file for the enforcement division." I let my voice drop into a conspiratorial tone. You know, my job isn't just counting pennies anymore. I'm looking at some very big, very bad numbers." His eyes widened, not with guilt over the affair, but with professional terror. He didn't know how much I knew, but the fact that I was focused on a high-risk file was enough to panic the lawyer in him. "You need to leave." "Elias," I said, my tone shifting to firm command. "Sterling and Rowe is under observation by my agency. If a senior analyst is seen interacting personally with a lawyer from the firm on a high-risk day, it could create compliance issues for both of us. Go back to work." He stood there, mouth open, the expensive flowers drooping slightly in his hands. He was utterly defeated, his personal plea nullified by my professional authority. He didn't even try to hand me the roses as he backed away. I went straight from that encounter to my final pre-filing meeting with Patricia Reeves. "I'm ready to drop the papers," Patricia confirmed. We have the human capital investment, the financial irregularities, and his confirmed adultery. We will bankrupt him on principle. I have one request, I said. The partners at Sterling and Rowe are meeting next Thursday to finalize Elias's promotion. The docket is set for 10 a.m. I want the divorce papers served to his office at exactly 10:01 a.m. I want it to be delivered during his moment of triumph. Patricia smiled. A rare, beautiful thing. Consider it done, Sarah. 1 minute of professional grace, immediately followed by financial and personal execution. The moment of the drop was surgically precise. At 10:01 a.m., just as the Sterling and Rowe partners likely raised their champagne flutes to toast their newest member, the process server walked into Elias's sleek, expensive corner office and handed him the dissolution papers. Chaos, controlled and delicious, ensued. My phone blew up instantly. First, a barrage of texts, shifting wildly in tone. This is a joke. Sarah. Wright quickly transitioned to call me now. This is career suicide for both of us, and finally, you'll regret this. I'll take everything. I silenced my work phone, put my personal one on airplane mode, and focused on an extremely boring compliance report. That day, I officially moved. I didn't hire movers. I just brought the few bags I had packed weeks ago to the luxury micro unit I had rented. I left almost everything else behind. I left his $5,000 bespoke suits hanging in the closet. I left the absurd collection of status watches, the Rolex, the Omega, the Patek Philippe, right where they sat in the safe. I wanted him to come home to a house full of useless objects that proved his identity was built on things, not people. My silence was the loudest statement I could make. Elias showed up at my new building that evening. I heard the commotion first, a series of enraged, muffled shouts in the hallway outside my door. Then the aggressive, rapid hammering on the solid wood. Sarah, open this door. I know you're in there. We need to talk before you destroy my life. I did not move from the sofa. I had already anticipated this. Patricia had armed me with a script. I picked up my phone, my hand completely steady. I did not dial 911. I dialed the non-emergency police line, stated my address, and calmly reported a domestic disturbance an estranged husband was attempting to force entry and making threats. I gave them his name, his high-status job, and then I emphasized that I was safe but deeply concerned for my privacy and property. The police arrived in under 5 minutes. Elias, a high-powered attorney, was instantly defanged by 2 uniformed officers telling him to disperse immediately or face a public nuisance arrest. He retreated, swearing under his breath, his dignity completely stripped away in a common apartment hallway. With the divorce papers filed, I pulled the trigger on the media angle. I sent Liam, the reporter, a single anonymous email containing meticulously sanitized and slightly obscured data points the existence of a shell corporation related to Aegis Corp, the abnormal profit-sharing structure, and a strong suggestion of conflict of interest at Sterling and Rowe's senior partner level. I did not mention Elias or Octavia by name. I just provided the roadmap to a massive front-page scandal. The next afternoon, the inevitable happened. I was in a public square, grabbing a salad, when Octavia Hayes approached my table. She sat down, uninvited. "You filed, Sarah," she said, her voice low and furious. "That was petty and expensive. Elias is hysterical. He should be talking to my lawyer. Octavia," I said, taking a bite of lettuce. She dismissed that with a wave. "Forget the divorce. Let's talk about the other thing, the financial files." She leaned in, her eyes hard and calculating. "I know you were helping him with his partner submission. You have access to things. Anything you might have stumbled upon, any sensitive financial information would be worth a great deal to me to keep confidential." It was a blatant bribe. She was not worried about Elias's marriage. She was terrified of what my penny counting had revealed. I smiled, a slow, genuine smile of pure victory. "I don't count pennies anymore, Octavia, and I know precisely what your work is worth. And more importantly, I know the value of your risk profile." Her desperation sharpened her tongue. Look, Elias is a fool, but he's telling the partners you're the problem. He tried to dump the blame for the initial Aegis accounting errors on you, called you an amateur accountant who misunderstood the filing system, said you were too clumsy to handle the big numbers. The words hit me not with pain, but with a surge of cold fury. The humiliation at the dinner table was one thing, but destroying my professional reputation, the reputation I had fought for and built, was unforgivable. Thank you for confirming that, Octavia, I said, standing up. Confirming what? She snapped. My full commitment, I replied. This is no longer just about a divorce. This is about making sure his world, and yours, ceases to exist. I'm protecting my name. I left her sitting alone at the table. My resolve hardened to diamond. Octavia's attempt to use Elias's betrayal as a bargaining chip had only guaranteed her own destruction. She had confirmed that they would burn my career to save theirs, and now I knew exactly how deep I needed to bury them both. The newspaper hit the streets like a tactical strike. Liam's piece, meticulously researched and heavily sourced from my anonymous tips, did not name Sterling and Rowe, but it provided enough detail about a prominent San Francisco law firm and its questionable structuring of Aegis Corp's offshore assets to send shockwaves through the financial district. The article hinted at tax evasion and what the writer delicately termed aggressive profit laundering techniques. Within 48 hours, the necessary regulatory noise had reached a crescendo. The Sentinel Group received a formal, urgent mandate from the Federal Oversight Committee. We were tasked with conducting a rapid, comprehensive audit of Sterling and Rowe LLP to assess their systemic risk profile in light of the public allegations. My internal request to lead the strategic audit team was approved without question. My supervisor, Mark, personally handed me the file. Sarah, you asked for the Aegis Corp records months ago. You flagged their structure before the paper did. You have the deepest institutional knowledge here. You're the only person who can run this. I accepted the appointment with a practiced, stone-cold professional demeanor. My past as the dismissed wife was now my greatest professional asset. Then came the big twist, the moment I had been planning for. The initial meeting with Sterling and Rowe's leadership was scheduled. The firm's representatives, listed on the official communication, were Octavia Hayes, senior partner, and Elias Thorne, candidate for partner. They were walking straight into the trap I had built for them, and they thought they were walking into a negotiation. Before the meeting, I focused on the counter-evidence dossier. This was a purely private document, an amalgamation of the divorce evidence and the criminal findings. It was not for Sentinel's file. It was my tactical weapon. It contained the proof of their affair, the conflicting expense reports, the signed wire transfer for the shady hedge fund, and the documentation showing Elias's attempt to blame me for accounting errors. It was my safety net, my sword, and my shield, all ready to be deployed the second they dared to challenge my professional authority. The phone calls started again. Elias, this time, was terrified, not angry. He sounded small, weak. Sarah, please, you have to help me, he pleaded. The firm is tearing itself apart. Octavia is panicking. I know you're running the audit. You can see the initial findings. We can fix this. You know the file better than anyone. You helped me put it together. Just tell me what reports to adjust. I took a deep, steadying breath. My voice, when I spoke, was pure Sentinel protocol. Mr. Thorne, you are a subject of a federal risk assessment. I am the lead auditor. Any conversation regarding the adjustment or modification of financial reporting would constitute obstruction of justice. I let that hang in the air for a moment. Furthermore, you are no longer my husband. Our only communication is now legally required to go through the proper professional channels. I cannot and will not jeopardize my career for your convenience. He sputtered, desperate. My convenience. This is my partnership, my life. You had a high-priority meeting with the Oversight Committee at 10:01 a.m. Elias, I countered, referring to the divorce papers. You decided what our priorities were. I am simply adhering to them. I hung up. I did not wait for his reply. The time for personal arguments was over. Finally, I used the leverage I had gained through the initial audit mandate. Before the first official meeting, I sent an internal directive to the Sentinel team. Due to the extreme risk of asset flight and documented evidence of complex offshore transactions, we are implementing a temporary freeze on certain personal and corporate accounts associated with the primary subjects of the inquiry, specifically Octavia Hayes and Elias Thorne, effective immediately. It was a cold, administrative measure, but its effect was brutally personal. I was not waiting for them to move their fortunes. I had tied up their money, their exit route, and their professional lives, all before I even set foot back in the offices of Sterling and Rowe. The game was now being played entirely on my terms. I walked back into the Sterling and Rowe LLP building exactly 30 days after I had walked out, dismissed and humiliated. The difference this time was stark. I wasn't ushered in by Elias's nervous, proprietary hand. I was met by the firm's chief compliance officer, a man whose hands were visibly shaking. I was not the partner's wife. I was the official representative of a federal oversight agency, leading a team that could shut down their entire operation. I was greeted with cold corporate respect, a far more powerful currency than the false warmth they had offered before. Before the meeting, I had a quick private coffee with Patricia Reeves in a lobby cafe. Octavia Hayes is a barracuda, Sarah, Patricia warned me, her eyes locked on mine. She'll try to discredit the Sentinel audit as a personal vendetta. Elias will throw himself on the mercy of the court, literally or figuratively. You have to be ice. If they try anything, we have the sealed complaint detailing his financial fraud and the affair ready to file with the presiding judge. I'm not worried about their counterattack, I said, sipping my espresso. I'm worried about finishing this audit flawlessly. I entered the grand mahogany-paneled conference room. Elias and Octavia were already seated, side by side, looking like two criminals who had been forced to share a defense table. They looked tense, haggard, and pale. I sat down, placing my custom Sentinel group binder on the enormous table. I made sure to take the chair directly opposite Octavia. We were not equals. I was the judge, and she was the defendant. Octavia, true to form, immediately tried to seize control. Ms. Vance, she began, her tone dismissive. While we respect the Sentinel Group's mission, we must question the scope of this emergency audit. Frankly, we view this as a bureaucratic overreach prompted by an irresponsible newspaper article. She paused, letting her implication hang in the air. Perhaps we should discuss the jurisdictional limitations before we proceed. I did not flinch. Lawyer Hayes, I said, my voice calm, professional, and dense with technical jargon. The Federal Oversight Committee's mandate grants the Sentinel Group full authority under Title 31, Section 534 of the U.S. Code. Given the documented inconsistencies in Aegis Corp's FATCA reporting and the potential material misstatement of assets involving cross-jurisdictional shell entities, your firm's role as legal counsel places you under direct scrutiny for systematic risk exposure. I had used 3 acronyms and 2 complex statutes in one breath. Octavia had to physically restrain herself from flipping through her notes. My command of their legal and financial world was now obviously superior to hers. Elias saw his opening and tried to use the personal connection to derail me. Sarah, look, he interjected, leaning forward desperately. We don't need to do this. We need to talk about what we had. You know my intentions. You know I cut him off, my voice sharp enough to draw blood, but devoid of all emotion. Lawyer Thorne, I said clearly, addressing him as formally as I would a complete stranger. We are currently in a federally mandated risk audit. All of our interactions are confined to professional matters only. Any attempt to introduce personal or irrelevant material will be logged as non-cooperation and reported directly to the Oversight Committee. He shrank back into his chair, stunned into silence. I had officially erased our marriage from the professional space. I pressed my advantage, moving straight to the core of their corruption. We noted a discrepancy in a series of transfers dated 3 weeks ago, specifically involving the liquidation of assets tied to the Cyprus holdings. We have flagged transaction code 790 Delta as highly irregular. The change in Octavia was instantaneous. Her steely composure shattered. Her eyes, which had been contemptuous moments before, flashed with raw panic. That was the code for the specific transaction she thought she had buried, the one I had received in the blurry email. She suddenly understood I wasn't just auditing Sterling and Rowe. I was auditing her. That code refers to a low-level, administrative accounting error. Octavia scrambled, her voice too loud. It was handled by a junior associate, Mr. Peterson. He was, coincidentally, recently terminated. Elias immediately piled on. Yes, Peterson was sloppy. Octavia and I were forced to clean up his mess. I gave them a cold, humorless smile. Mr. Peterson was terminated 2 months before that transaction took place. Please provide the internal memo detailing how a fired employee managed to authorize a 6-figure wire transfer. Their faces went slack. I had caught them in a simple, desperate lie, exposing the flaw in their hastily constructed defense. I closed my binder with a decisive snap. The sound echoed in the silent room. This concludes our initial information gathering session, I announced. My team requires full transparency. To assess the systemic financial risk your firm poses, we require complete, unredacted personal financial disclosures, not just partnership assets from all senior equity partners and those pending promotion. That includes you, Lawyer Hayes, and you, Lawyer Thorne. My demand was not a question. It was a cold, absolute command. You will provide these records to the Sentinel Group within 24 hours. I stood up. I had just demanded the keys to their entire financial lives. The confrontation was set. The 24-hour deadline passed. Predictably, Octavia and Elias provided a stack of highly redacted documents, citing attorney-client privilege and sensitive proprietary information as their shield. It was a flimsy delay tactic. I rejected their submission immediately. I didn't waste time going back to the main conference room. I summoned them to a small, windowless executive briefing room on a lower floor. The atmosphere was tight, controlled, and distinctly adversarial. I sat at the head of the small table. My Sentinel Group colleague, a compliance specialist named David, sat at my right. Octavia and Elias were relegated to the side seats. It was an interrogation setup, and I was running the show. Lawyer Hayes, Lawyer Thorne, I began, my voice dry and unwavering. Your submission is incomplete. The privilege you claim does not extend to personal financial disclosures mandated by a federal oversight investigation. Octavia tried to fight. This is an abusive process. You're on a fishing expedition, and we refuse to hand over our private financial data to what is essentially a competitor's wife on a personal crusade. I ignored the insult. Let's move past the disclosures and discuss what Sentinel has already found. I pulled up the initial findings on the projector screen. It showed 2 columns of data Aegis Corp's reported overseas profit and their actual cash flow into U.S. markets. The discrepancy was astronomical. These numbers are inconsistent, I stated, pointing to the gap. The flow of capital suggests an active mechanism to shield over $300 million in revenue. Our preliminary audit trail shows these transactions were consistently approved and structured by senior legal counsel at this firm. I looked directly at Octavia. That structure, Lawyer Hayes, bears your signature. Octavia's face flushed scarlet. She slammed her hand on the table. I deny that those transactions were standard tax mitigation strategy. The room was suddenly charged with tension. This was the moment for the private execution. I nodded to David, who discreetly placed the anonymized St. Regis Hotel folio on the table, face up. I did not reference the content. I did not have to. Tax mitigation, I continued smoothly, becomes professional misconduct when it is tainted by a conflict of interest. Our ongoing investigation will consider whether the personal relationship between two key figures on the Aegis file, a relationship that generated expense reports for luxury resorts, compromised the objective legal counsel given to your client. Octavia looked down at the folio, her breath hitching. Elias stared straight ahead, rigid with terror. I had exposed their secret in the most clinical, damaging way possible as a threat to their professional liability. I shifted my focus entirely to Elias. Lawyer Thorne, let's discuss your personal financial decisions. We note a significant withdrawal from your joint brokerage account, funds you invested into an obscure, high-risk venture fund, a fund advised by one of Lawyer Hayes's non-client associates. Elias was sweating profusely. He was brilliant with legal theory, but faced with raw financial numbers and technical questions about the fund's limited partnership agreement, he was lost. He stammered, "That was a high-yield opportunity. It was for our future. Ms. Vance. It was a legal investment. It was a clear violation of your spousal fiduciary duty, as demonstrated in our divorce filing, and highly suspicious as a solo investment by an attorney with inside knowledge of the consulting group's client base," I corrected him. I leaned across the table, my eyes burning into his. "You once said, Lawyer Thorne, that my job was to count pennies. Well, my penny counting showed me exactly what you were hiding, not just from me, but from the IRS and every one of your partners." The door of the small room burst open. The twist was breathtaking. Arthur Sterling, one of the firm's founding and most senior partners, the man who had just voted in favor of Elias's promotion, strode in. He held a tablet in his hand, his face a mask of furious disappointment. He had clearly been briefed on my preliminary findings. "This is unacceptable. Octavia," Arthur roared, not looking at anyone else. "I've seen enough of the Sentinel data. The structure you signed off on is indefensible. The personal misconduct is a liability that will destroy this firm." He pointed a trembling finger at Octavia. "You are to submit your resignation, effective immediately." Octavia leaped up, venom in her eyes. She whirled on Elias. He was involved. Arthur. He did the wire transfers. He was with me the whole time. Elias, seeing the life raft, pushed her away. I was following my superior's instructions. He cried, his voice high and thin. "I only drafted the documents. She signed off on everything. I was just a junior associate doing what my senior partner told me." The room dissolved into pure, raw panic. Octavia had been consumed by the fire, and Elias was desperately trying to sever his own limb to escape. I watched them tear each other apart over a table that I now, quietly and completely, controlled. I allowed the chaotic spectacle to run its course for another 60 seconds. Elias, flushed and panicked, yelling about Octavia's direction. Octavia, incandescent with rage, accusing Elias of being an incompetent drafting monkey. Arthur Sterling, the senior partner, stood over them, looking like a man watching his fortune burn. David, my compliance officer, was silently recording everything, the indirect admissions of guilt falling into my lap like ripe fruit. When the noise peaked, I clapped my hands once, sharply. The small room fell silent. "We are done with the theater," I stated, my voice cutting through the remaining tension. "Let's address the core professional liability." I ignored their personal drama and moved to the most damaging charge. Our final audit reveals that Lawyer Hayes used insider information related to the upcoming Aegis acquisition to execute personal securities trades, utilizing the offshore entities as a shield. Lawyer Thorne provided the technical blueprint and executed the transfers to conceal the transaction trail. I clicked a button on my laptop, displaying the counter-evidence dossier. It was a clean, professionally formatted summary, but the contents were toxic. It included the internal emails, the wire transfer confirmation, and the precise moment-by-moment log of the trades. I had not just found fraud, I had found a deliberate scheme. Octavia, realizing her career and possibly her freedom were dissolving, reacted violently. She grabbed the nearest stack of file folders, her own defense memos, and hurled them across the table at me. They scattered harmlessly on the floor. "This is personal. This is an act of spousal revenge. You are using a federal agency to settle your bitter divorce," she shrieked. I smiled at her, a gesture of cold, clinical finality. I did not raise my voice. "This is a risk audit, Lawyer Hayes," I replied calmly. "I found your firm's largest, most existential risk, and that risk was your arrogance." I paused, letting the word sink in. Arrogance. Then came the final devastating turn. I looked past Octavia, straight at Elias, who looked like a man already condemned. "Lawyer Thorne," I said, my voice heavy with betrayal and triumph. "Do you want to know how I found the transaction code, the offshore shell structure, and the entire transfer protocol you thought was so secure?" He could only shake his head weakly. "It didn't come from the Sentinel Group's initial deep dive," I revealed. "It came from the very set of documents you submitted for your partner promotion. The documents I spent 6 months helping you compile." His eyes widened in recognition. Then horror. He realized his fatal mistake. "You wanted to prove you were on a higher level than me," I continued, the words perfectly precise. "You put every single detail, every single technical loophole, into those files because you wanted to show off your brilliance to the partners. You thought I was too stupid to read them. You thought I would just format the binders and count the pages. You left the entire roadmap to your misconduct in your own hands. Elias, because you believed I was only capable of counting pennies." I stood up, signaling the end. "As the lead auditor for the Sentinel Group," I announced, addressing Arthur Sterling and my colleague David, "I recommend we immediately refer all of this evidence to the district attorney's office and request a full criminal investigation against both Lawyer Hayes and Lawyer Thorne for conspiracy to commit financial fraud and obstruction of justice." I gathered my Sentinel binder and walked toward the door. As I reached the exit, I heard Arthur Sterling on his phone, already speaking to building security and the police. I left Elias Thorne and Octavia Hayes in that small, windowless room, facing not just the loss of their careers, but the loss of their freedom. I had not just secured my divorce, I had secured my justice. The final details were handled with the efficiency of a high-speed legal cleanup crew. Patricia Reeves called me the next morning, her voice laced with grim satisfaction. "Elias's career is terminated. Sarah, his legal license is suspended pending the criminal inquiry. He can't afford to fight the divorce, and he can't afford discovery. He accepted the settlement without a fight. The agreement was swift and complete, uncontested dissolution, a majority share of the marital assets, and a substantial compensatory payment based on his lost earning potential. The human capital I had invested, I used the money, a figure in the high 6 digits, to instantly pay off the mortgage on the house I no longer wanted, cover my small amount of remaining student debt, and, most importantly, establish a personal investment fund. My financial safety was now absolute, built not on Elias's promise, but on his destruction. A few days later, the phone rang. It was Arthur Sterling himself, the senior partner I had left, standing over the ruin of his firm. "Ms. Vance," he said, his voice humbled, "we need your expertise. The Sentinel audit team has finished their initial review, and the damage is extensive. Octavia Hayes is gone. Thorne is gone. We need an immediate, highly skilled risk manager to oversee the internal remediation process. We need someone who knows our vulnerabilities better than we do." I was invited back to Sterling and Rowe, not as an auditor, but as a temporary risk management consultant. The final twist came when I was escorted to my new working space. We walked past the empty offices of lawyers scrambling to save their clients. We walked past the empty desk where Elias had once boasted of his future millions. And then, the compliance officer paused. "This will be your office, Ms. Vance," he said. He opened the heavy oak door. I stepped inside. It was Octavia Hayes's old office, the enormous corner suite overlooking the entire expanse of the San Francisco Bay. The room of absolute power. Arthur Sterling was waiting for me. "We've seen your work," he admitted, a note of awe in his voice. "We realize we need more than a temporary fix. We are proposing a long-term strategic partnership with the Sentinel Group, and we want you to lead the entire project. You will have carte blanche to rebuild our internal structure." I walked over to the desk. It was the same desk I had seen on that humiliating night, the six-figure mahogany expanse. I sat down in the enormous, expensive leather chair that Octavia had once occupied. The chair where she had laughed and told me I was too small for this table. The leather was supple, the position commanding. My cell phone vibrated. An unfamiliar number. I knew it was Elias. I answered. His voice was cracked, defeated. "Sarah, I heard. I'm so sorry. I'm begging you. Can you just call off the DA, please?" I looked out at the bay, the light gleaming on the water. I let a long, powerful silence stretch between us. "I gave you the silence you wanted, Elias," I finally said. "Now, I am giving you the consequence you earned." I hung up, not with a slam, but with a firm, quiet click, and then I blocked the number forever. I formally accepted the role. I was no longer the consultant. I was the one holding the actual power inside the very firm where they had tried to erase me. I took a slow sip of the coffee I had bought for myself that morning, not needing a maid or a husband to prepare it. This was the taste of real victory, intellectual, solitary, and final. True revenge was building a life so magnificent. I never had to look back at the wreckage I had left behind. I turned to my computer, ready to start the day. I was no longer counting pennies. I was deciding the fate of billion-dollar corporations. The seat was mine. I won. Thank you for listening to my story. Please comment below and let me know where in the world you are listening from and what your thoughts are on Sarah's final move. Make sure to subscribe to Lily Revenge Stories, like this video, and hit the hype button to make sure this story is heard by more people.